What's up? Ghost Fictions is here, and we're back again. This is the second part of a story where Issei was the true primordial dragon god of death. But before we start, please consider subscribe to the channel and give this video a like. Don't forget to check the description for more informations. Let's get into part 2. Same time Earth. Silence. That's how the planet Earth was. All around the globe everything had fallen deathly silent. Those that had seen the phenomenon were frozen in terror and others in a state of morbid awe. The rest were fast asleep, completely unaware of what just transpired above their heads. But centered where the pillar of darkness originated from, near the grounds of Kuo Academy, a gathering of devils stood within the old schoolhouse, a bit aways from the academy itself. It was the gathered peerage of Ria's Gremory who was stationed all around the meeting room. Ria sat at her desk rubbing her forehead, trying in vain to ease her rattled nerves. Akeno is always at her side, but her usual smile was gone, and trouble's look was clear in her eyes. Kiba, the blonde-haired prince of Kuo Academy, sat on the couch, trying to find a way to keep himself busy. But his whole body was a trembling mess, he couldn't even keep his hands from shaking. They had all been nearly crushed to death by a power spike that originated not too far from the academy, a few miles at best. It lasted for a good whole minute or two until it eventually stopped. But the anxiety and fear they felt was still fresh in their mind. But Kaneko, the one sitting at the window staring out in a direction, who had recovered first and was just staring out at a random location. Her eyes seemingly fixated on something the others couldn't see. "But what should we do?" Akeno said, causing Rias to sigh. In all honesty, Rias was still sweating due to the spike of power she felt just minutes ago. It was an energy she knew all too well, it was the very same essence as Issei's, but the logical part of her mind was denying that Issei, no matter how strong, could have had a sacred gear that strong that could cause something like this. However, the other side, the hopeful part, was telling her that was the Hyoudou boy that had caused this. Which also meant he had been killed, meaning the spell she had used had actually worked. "I don't know. Akeno, Sona and her peerage are working tirelessly to repair the damage around the city and re-establish connection with the underworld. For us, I just don't know." This was the first Rias had ever felt so shaken in all her life. Her body refused to even remove itself from the seat, no matter how dire the situation was outside. She knew why it was. It was because she was afraid, deathly afraid of whatever had just been unleashed. At first she thought Issei had some sort of powerful sacred gear, but when she felt his life go out she felt something change, something abnormal happened. The forbidden spell she put on the brochure she gave him had worked, that much she was certain, but beyond that everything just went beyond her comprehension. "I knew he would be too powerful for any pieces, even all the 8 pawn pieces couldn't match up to the value of what he had. That much was evident enough from the amount of power he was giving off," she thought, which was one of the reasons why her interest in the Hyoudou had been so great, yet it is also why she had decided to make a risky move. Since she knew reincarnating Issei when he died wouldn't be possible, she had utilized a forbidden spell that was locked away in her family's library. It was a dark art spell that would resurrect the life of the one in contact of the spell, but the cost at times was said to usually backfire on the target and kill the user, which thankfully enough it didn't happen. She'd taken the risk of just bringing him back to life after he died, just to see what he would become, using a spell that was strictly forbidden by her family. And now she was wondering if it was worth it, since she just couldn't feel Issei's presence at all now. But then something happened, a flash of red caught her and her peerage's attention, and she turned to see, to her shock, a red runic circle, the very same design she had inscribed on the brochure she gave to Issei, form in the middle of the room. It glowed, showing that it was ready for the transport, a spell she put on in case it was needed to arrive at his location, so she could help fend off those that attacked him. "This can't be. How is this here? He's dead, isn't he?" Ria said, only for Kaneko to speak up. "Issei-senpai needs help, but you..." She looked at her cowhide only to see a forlorn expression on the girl's face. Biting her lower lip, Rias turned her gaze from Kaneko's hazel eyes and back to the circle. Maybe he had survived. Kaneko, after all, was sensitive to all forms of life around her, so maybe she could sense his life force somewhere out there. Looking back at Kaneko, Ria sighed before giving a small smile, so she fought against her trembling body and stood up. "Very well, Kaneko, you will come with me and we'll see if we can find Issei-san. Akeno, Kiba, I want you to remain here in case Sona re-establishes connection the underworld, that way in case my brother arrives, you can keep him here until I return." The Gremory princess ordered her queen and knight, who nodded. "Hi, but you." Pleasantly smiling at the two, she and Kaneko walked toward the red circle and stood in the middle, neither of the two not knowing what would happen once they arrived at the location. As the circle's transportation magic began to work, Kaneko looked in the direction she felt Issei's presence, and she frowned sadly. "Issei-senpai is in pain." Then the two disappeared in a flash of red light. Same time Park District. Bakabiel prided himself on being a man that wasn't afraid of anything, what with having faced the biblical god, the 4 original Maus, and came out as a survivor of the Great War. He would have figured that he had seen everything that could have put the fear into him. However, as he floated a few feet above the epicenter of where he had lost his vision for an instant, he was proven very wrong. For he was feeling fear, and not just normal fear, a primal fear that surged from the very soul. "You are not human, what are you?" spat the fallen angel. His usual pale complexion was deathly white, sweating uncontrollably. He tried in vain to ease his body. But it was shaking too much for him to even do anything besides flying, and even that was proving difficult. Bakabiel's red eyes stayed directly on the one who he had once thought was a mere mortal, but that was thrown to the wind once he experienced minutes prior. This was no longer a human, nay, this thing was something else entirely. This wasn't a demon, not a devil, not an angel, and not even an abomination. It was just something else. Standing at the epicenter, the changed Hyoudou Issei stood, motionless, with his head held down. His long black bangs shadowed his face as he stood tall, imposing and utterly terrifying to Bakabiel. His cloak made up of solely darkness stuck to him like a second skin, the bottom seemingly burning into tatters yet reforming back. The area around him was turned gray, the grass had died, the bench he and Yuma once sat on just relaxing in each other's presence rotted away. Yet the strangest thing was that Yuma's cold corpse hadn't been affected at all by the release of Issei's power. No, her body was in fact glowing with a dark greenish glow with a blackish hue. Issei seemingly ignored Bakabiel's presence entirely. At this point raised his head, allowing his black locks to part way, revealing the pristine bone-white mask covering most of his face. His smoldering golden red orb saw only one thing as his priority. He turned almost robotically towards Yuma's body and moved to her, catching the attention of Bakabiel, but the fallen angel remained silent. He wished to make a snark remark, but something was staying his tongue, as if something was clutching his very soul, and it threatened to end his life with a simple gesture if he so much as spoke a word. Besides, what can he do now? The wench is dead, her soul is gone to the underworld, doomed to be tormented until the end of time. He thought with small satisfaction, and it was at that moment as Issei made his way to Yuma's cooling corpse that a flash of red light caught Bakabiel's attention, and yet it was ignored by Issei. Appearing not a few feet away by the Hyoudou, 2 figures appeared from a red transportation circle, as they were assimilated from red particles of demonic energy. Bakabiel took the time to mask his presence for the moment. His eyes glancing from the circle and sensing the two's energy not worth his time, he turned back at the Hyoudou, awaiting for the opportune time to strike. Soon enough the figures of both Ria's Gremory and Taoju Kaneko formed, and once they were fully aware of their surroundings, they were not prepared for what awaited them. They looked up at the sky to see a swirling mass of gray and black clouds, all slowly spinning like a giant maelstrom up in the air. Bolts of black lightning rumbled, and looking around them they saw the area seemed to have been sucked of all life, leaving everything just a shade of ash gray. But then she and Kaneko saw someone amidst this desolate land, walking steadily towards a downed female figure. It was only when their eyes focused enough that Ria's heard her rook, Kaneko, speak. "Issei-senpai," Kaneko said, causing the Gremory princess's eyes to widen in unadulterated shock. "Issei." That was Issei. She didn't feel anything from him now like she usually did. She didn't sense an ounce of his usually leaking dark aura. Hell, Ria's couldn't even sense a spark of energy from him now. He was just there, existing. "How do you know it's Issei, Kaneko?" she said, but the girl remained unresponsive before she started walking toward the figure that was Issei, and being a tad hesitant herself, Ria's followed in suit. It was only when they got closer that they were able to discern Issei's appearance. And if Kaneko hadn't been entirely sure that it was him, then they would have thought this to be a total stranger. His 6'0" figure was as imposing as it was foreboding, garbed only in a billowing obsidian cloak that seemed to burn into tatters and reform endlessly. Reaching up to his neck, it seemed to just shift around his body, as if it had a will of its own. His once light brown hair was now pitch black and was long and straight, reaching past his neckline and to his shoulder blades. The two girls were only able to see his backside. They moved in closer as Issei moved toward the downed figure, which they soon found it to be that Yuma girl that was always with him. The fallen angel that was observing him. It seems as if she was pierced through the heart. But looking at the scene, it doesn't seem like there was a struggle. What killed her? Yuma-san. She heard Kaneko speak with a rare moment of solemnness. Ah yes, that's right, she had hung around Issei, who was with Yuma most of the time. Kaneko must have befriended the fallen angel to some degree. The two girls stopped as Issei came to Yuma's cold corpse, his head down, looking down at her lifeless eyes. Then he kneeled on one leg and reached out to her, dipping his hand under her neck and in a slow yet gentle motion. As if Issei was handling something extremely fragile. He lifted her head up, causing her black hair to part way, revealing her lifeless violet eyes that stared up at nothing, and behind his mask, Issei's golden red eyes closed for a moment, his mask hiding his face from the world. Uma. The change in his voice startled the two girls, the deep guttural sound it made caused them to shiver on the spot. Riaz may not have been able to feel a thing from Issei now, but she sure felt something from his voice, and that something made her body tremble in coldness. They watched as his other hand came up to her face, pushing her black locks behind her ear and seemed to caress her cheek. But soon enough Kaneko fought down her hesitation and came closer to Issei's kneeled form, and Riaz, alarmed for the safety of her Rukan mentality of Issei, followed as well. Kaneko came to Uma's other side and slowly kneeled down as Riaz kneeled beside her. Issei-senpai. Kenko spoke monotonously, but the sadness was evident in her voice. However, Issei seemed to hear her, and the two were welcomed to a sight that made their souls cry out in terror. They couldn't see Issei's face besides his cheeks, for it was mostly covered by a pristine bone-white mask, resembling the frontal piece of a skull. Similar to that of an executioner's mask in some aspect. And staring through the bone-white eye holes was a pair of golden red eyes that truly revealed that something in the Issei they knew had changed. Something had awoken in him, something far more unholy than anything Riaz could ever think in the deepest parts of her nightmares. It was the same for Kaneko, who was kneeled, frozen in place as those eyes peered at her. These eyes terrified her more than that of the rampage she saw of her older sister, Kuroka, who went made with power so long ago. What happened to you, senpai? The albino-haired girl stuttered out, and the masked man tilted his head at her before he cast his gaze to Riaz. For a moment he held her eyes, staring through her blue-green eyes, laying her soul bare before his golden-red smoldering orbs. Then he just looked back down at Uma, leaving Kaneko's question unanswered. And as if instinct urged him, he raised his free hand from Uma's cheek and brought up his palm. And to their amazement and slight apprehension, his hand was engulfed in an aura of purple and black. It soon began to solidify into a small wispy sphere that was the size of a softball. Is that? It can't be. Riaz soon realized it when she saw the wispy sphere conform in Issei's hand, who gently brought it down to Uma's dead corpse. The slight whispers and echoing cry originating from the sphere was all Riaz needed to know to realize what it was. It was a soul, and not just any soul, it was this fallen angel's soul. What kind of power do you have to pluck a soul from the depths of the underworld and from the governing watch of Hades himself? Issei, what have you become? Riaz thought, watching in fascination as Issei did the seemingly impossible before her and Kaneko's eyes. He brought the sphere down and let it sink into Uma's body, and as it did he brought his hand up to her wound, and his palm glowed a light green hue before letting the greenish energy reach out to her fatal wound, which it was soon healed in seconds. Heart regenerating back, flesh and torn tissue sticking back as if nothing had happened. When that was finished, Riaz and Kaneko watched in shock as Uma's pulse returned, her chest began to move up, and the slight thrumming beat of her heart showed her heart was back and healthy as ever. Riaz and Kaneko looked up from Uma to Issei's silent form in total shock at this point. They had just witnessed Issei pull the impossible. Killing something near death was good, but what he just did was on a whole other level. He just resurrected the dead, pulled the soul of one lost to the underworld controlled by Hades, and brought her back to life. Amazing. The words left her lips, the Gremory princess's eyes bespoke of the amazement she felt, and for a moment as Issei laid Uma's head back down and stood back up. For a single moment, Riaz felt as if she were staring up at the presence of something beyond the trivial comprehension of sacred gear. She felt as if she were staring up into the face of a deity, of a true god. But then, why resurrect the one who killed you? Unless. I knew it. You are a monster. Kakabiel's voice sounded, alerting both Riaz and Kaneko, who looked up to see Kakabiel appearing from a distortion spell that hid his presence. Their eyes went wide in alarm at seeing such a figure of legend just a few feet above them. But to him, his eyes simply passed them by and were trained solely on Issei, with a great deal of alarm and rage in his yellow eyes. Hey Kakabiel. One of the three leaders of the Grigori. Why are you here? This was bad, very very bad. Someone like him was here already. Riaz could tell the situation was already extremely terrible if this man was here. She knew without a doubt there wasn't anyone near them in the city that could take on Kakabiel, and the one that could on equal ground were her brother and the other Maus. After all, this man survived battle against God himself and even fought against the original Satans. This man was not to be trifled with, and yet the question pegged her, why was one with such status here? For your information, sister of Lucifer, I am here to kill that thing near you, but don't worry, you and the feline will soon join him. He said, floating from his spot in the sky. Riaz stood up, as did Kaneko, readying themselves. However, Riaz was thinking a mile a second, trying in vain to think of way to get out of the situation. It was very clear to her now as to the one who had killed Issei prior. It wasn't the Uma girl, it was Kakabiel that had killed him. But that wasn't as important as the fact to how they were gonna get out of this situation alive. But it was not to be as Issei turned around, seemingly finding it in himself to even acknowledge Kakebiel's very existence. No. Speaking out, he walked forward, passing both Rias and Kaneko. With them staring at his back, he raised his hand, the only thing not covered, which showed that even the flesh of his fingers had turned ash gray. His index finger pointed directly at Kakebiel, his eyes set into the form of a glare. "You are mine," he said. It wasn't anything else but that of a statement. Clear and true, Issei's intention was clear as day to them all, and Kakebiel's expression twisted into a form of amusement and disgust all into one. "You dare challenge me, abomination? Fine. I'll end you where you stand," he said before he reached out with both hands, and soon multiple spears of holy light much bigger than an average-sized one began to assimilate. "No, Issei, don't." Rias tried to get his attention, to stop him from this foolhardy decision, but the masked Hyoudou didn't even seem to hear her or acknowledge her. All that mattered in his eyes was Kakebiel, the one who hurt and killed his second friend. His intention was clear in his golden red orbs, he was going to kill this guy. He'd inflict as much pain as he could on this man who dared to lay a hand on Yuma. Die. Cackling out in glee, Kakebiel sent out the vast spears of holy energy towards Issei, but as they all converged on him, he didn't so much as move. No, he stood still as a mountain as the spears came in contact with his body, but like before they were just absorbed into his body, dissipating the holy light, as if it were a flickering ember. Seeing this made Rias and Kaneko's eyes widen, but Kakebiel's gnashed his teeth in annoyance. He absorbed the spears, thought Rias, who was shocked at seeing such a thing happen. Yet again with your trickery. How about this then? Raising both hands into the air, he started to assimilate a giant holy spear that grew and grew the more energy he used. Soon enough the spear was as tall as mansion-sized building. The spear crackled with pure raw holy energy, its light near blinding for both Rias and Kaneko, who could feel their flesh just sizzle by the presence of spear. There was no doubt that spear would vaporize any high-class devils in an instant. Ha! Hurling the spear down toward the masked Hyoudou, Kakebiel watched, glaring down at this thing that dared to oppose him. Surely, yes, surely this time it would vanquish this thing for good. But his hopes were for naught, as Issei just kept glaring straight at Kakebiel before he raised his hand towards the spear. It was of sheer instinct that drove him, making his body react accordingly to what was coming, and soon energy he had known since he was young was channeled into his hand, and he waited. He didn't need to wait long as the spear came on him with the force of a giant. The ground cratered beneath his feet, but he waited before forming his hand completely flat. Channeling his power at the edge of his hand, he moved, swiping his hand in a vertical motion toward the spear. It seemed as if nothing happened for a second until the spear slowly began to detach itself into two halves, as the very winds was cut by something unseen. But it didn't stop there, because as the others watched on in shock at what they were witnessing, Kakebiel never saw the entire right side of his wingspan shift before it was too late. Schlink. Pain, unbearable amounts of raw, agonizing pain erupted from Kakebiel's right side, and the man showed as he let loose a gut-wrenching scream. Ah! His scream alerted both girls, who turned to see Kakebiel holding his side, but falling from his body was half of his 10 black wings. Cut completely in half and straight through, a clean cut all through the bone and marrow. "What have you done to me?" he screamed as he tried to grow his wings back, but they weren't even reacting. Normally fallen angels were able to regrow their wings since it was a part of their body and in their ability to regrow the appendage. But this time Kakebiel couldn't muster up anything to regrow his wings. His soul felt as if were seared and dumped in a hole of the sharpest things in creation, piercing, slashing, cutting and stabbing into his soul. He turned to glare as the monster who did this to him, but his eyes widened in fright when he saw Issei's eyes glaring straight at him, through him with the full intention to kill him dead in his eyes. The heavily scarred fallen angel felt his skin crawl at those eyes. "A monster? You're a monster. Abomination," he spoke incoherently, fear beginning to settle in once he realized the true danger that he was in. Finally acknowledging the mistake he had made, in his stupidity, he had unleashed something far more dangerous than he'd ever seen before. "Flee. I have to run. This thing. It's gonna kill me." Issei kept his glare in place and was gonna head toward Kakebiel, but his eyes widened when he felt something within him churn up and rear its head. Its voice boomed with power that rattled his very mind. "Time to take a rest, Hyoudou Issei." Stumbling, Issei reached up to his face only to let out a strained grunt. "Ugh. Gah." He grunted, reaching up the mask covering his face, only for it begin cracking through the middle. This alerted both Rias and Kaneko, and they raced toward the boy. "Issei. Have a nice rest, Hyoudou Issei, we shall speak soon enough." The voice within his soul resonated, addressing him, he could feel it taking over. "No. I must kill him." What consciousness Issei still had opposed to force, but was quickly overpowered by the sentient life within his soul. "Do not be so hasty, you will get the chance to end him soon, but for now we have more important things to deal with." Now enough squabbling, good night." And that's all Issei heard before the mask cracked completely through down the middle and his body flickered with the billowing black cloak seemingly started to vanish. He stood there with his eyes started to return back to their light brown ones. His hair began to turn back to its normal shade and the growth of his began to return to normal as well. He stumbled once more before his cloak began to vanish into nothingness, leaving his naked upper body free. Left only in his school pants and no shoes or upper clothing, Issei felt his eyes begin to droop. Exhaustion beginning to settle in his system. His vision went blurry before he started fall. "Issei senpai." Rias and Kaneko shouted running towards his falling body before he was caught by them both, but his bone-white mask slid from his face in two halves. Falling to the ground in a clatter only it began to vanish into white particles which soon faded into nothingness as well. "Now's my chance to get out of here." Though his pride was immensely wounded he was not suicidal to stay and risk getting himself killed by that thing. Kakabiel turned his back on the scene. Creating a portal the scarred and pride-wounded Kakabiel growled before he went into the portal, fleeing from the one who had scarred him to such a degree. But he had been seen by Rias who had watched him flee, which caused her to look back down at Issei, whose head was situated on her lap. As Kaneko made sure everything of him was fine, Rias reached forward and parted his brown bangs from his eyes, just enough so she could see him clearly. "Once again you have exceeded my expectations. You may not know it now Issei, but what you just did was simply amazing. You've just made Kakabiel flee with his tail between his legs, you no longer interest me now Issei-san. No. Now. You simply excite me beyond reason." She thought, a passionate smile began to form as she looked down at the sleeping form of her cowhide. Though she knew it for sure now, her gamble had turned out in her favor. Issei had shown her just how incredible he would become in the supernatural world. Yes indeed, the future looked very interesting. For everyone and especially for one, Hyoudou Issei. Chapter 3. No longer human. "Will he be okay, but you?" Kaneko spoke, standing alongside Rias with their gazes looking down at an unconscious Issei. The two girls were standing inside Issei's bedroom at the current moment, having brought him back to his house. That is after Rias used a small spell on his parents that erased their memories of the last few hours, including their son being so late and of the phenomenon not long ago. She and Kaneko brought Issei back home and laid him to rest since after his whole ordeal with Kakabiel and whatever was inside him had proven to be very taxing. Of that she knew had to be true, it had to be since he just died, was resurrected through a forbidden spell on her part, resurrected someone back to life, and fended off Kakabiel enough to make him retreat. Yeah, that would tire out anyone, but as she looked at Issei her eyes softened as Kaneko kneeled at his bedside and just continued to gaze at him. Her small hand going up to his light brown hair that was once longer and jet black. Letting her fingers go through his hair, Kaneko looked at Issei's unresponsive face and then to Rias. "I'm sure he will be fine Kaneko, most people when they die and are reincarnated usually go into an unconscious state. And while he wasn't reincarnated, he still just needs rest." Though she said that, she was still worried just as much as Kaneko was for Issei. Back then when he was about to continue fighting Kakabiel, it seemed as if something was forcing him to stop, it was as if he was struggling against something. She was sure that he was talking to someone or something else, but had been forced down by something and knocked the Hyoudou out from inside. Nevertheless, she wouldn't push for answers from Issei, it wasn't her right to do that. Everyone had their secrets and she didn't have the right to pry into his. Even though she was the one to bring him back, she wouldn't do him bad like that, no matter how much she wanted to learn more about the increasing enigma that was Hyoudou Issei. Plus if his display prior to now was anything to go by, she didn't want to get on his bad side, ever. Rias shivered at that, yes, she did not want to get on his bad list after witnessing all she had and felt from Issei. If there was one thing she was sure of it was that her cowhide was going to be a wild card in their world and personally she didn't want to be on the receiving end of those eyes. Rias frowned a tad when she heard the small grumble and she looked to see leaning against the wall, it was that Yuma girl that usually accompanied Issei. She was fast asleep having recovered from being resurrected by Issei and was just recuperating from the experience. She had contemplated on leaving her there seeing as she had no reason to help the fallen angel. After all they were still enemies even with the Great War having ended long ago, however she couldn't do that not after all that had happened. Not after what Issei did to bring her back from the grip of Hades, the Greek god who ruled over the realm of the dead. Such a feat in of itself was astronomically huge and yet daring all the same. Yet another reason why Issei simply fascinated her to no end. Nevertheless, Issei-kun brought her back to life and I'm inclined to keep her alive. I do want to learn more about him and invoking his wrath would just be counterproductive. Thinking this Rias nodded to herself. Unknown to her, Kaneko who was currently running her hand through Issei's hair, was staring at his sleeping face with her usual impassive expression. But in her hazel eyes was a glimmer of something else, affection, though she dared tell no one. She was look at her senpai with affection, a feeling she hadn't used since being with her big sister Kuroka. Hesitantly she moved her hand to his face, and as she caressed his cheek the smallest of smiles grew. Senpai. His warm again was her thought, and she was glad too. Having Issei back from his changed state prior had eased her worries, and she was very glad to have her senpai back. Well, it seemed to Rias and her peerage that Kaneko had become fond of Issei. It was much more than just that. Frankly speaking, Taoju Kaneko had been at first downright terrified of Issei due to the aura he gave off when he first transferred to Kuo Academy. Due to her being a Nekashu, a different variation of the Nekomata species, she had a high sensitivity to Senjutsu, or in layman's terms, the life force, and because of this, she was able to feel the life of the world around her. Her reach wasn't extensive since she was afraid of ever training with it, but it was enough so that she could feel for the entire Kuo Academy. Because of that, when Issei transferred into the academy and made his first step in, she was overrun with a great amount of terror. Due to always leaking out the dark aura, it began to saturate her sensory field around the academy, and it led her being hit with wave after wave of screams. Nature itself was crying out toward her, yelling and wailing out in fear of its imminent demise. It was as if a dark foreboding shadow had cast itself over the academy, with her being nearly swallowed up in its blackness, while at the cause of it all being Hyoudou Issei. She had nightmares for a bit after that, but thanks to the efforts of Kiba and Akeno, she was able to overcome them. She was afraid though that when she met Issei on their first encounter when she was being harassed by those other students that those nightmares would return. But she had been proven wrong, because despite what Issei's power had done to her, the man himself was not anything like it. He defended her, fiercely so she may add, was nice to her, and chased off those that annoyed and bothered her, treated her to sweets, and made conversation with her despite her hesitance. It was a contradiction to how utterly cold his power was, and yet Issei himself had been so kind and warm to her. It's why when she saw him in that form not long ago, that she had been both afraid of him as it rekindled that deep-rooted scare she received the first time around. But also a fear for Issei himself, since all she felt from him was just pain, so much pain resonating from his soul. It went out to her, his screams of anguish, his golden red eyes spoke of the despair he suffered when Yuma had died. He had changed in her eyes when he was in that form. He wasn't her Issei senpai anymore, no, he was just coldness incarnated. A specter of darkness that only radiated a soul-wrenching numbness which threatened to snuff out all life and light around him. It's why she was so happy to have her Issei senpai back to normal. She never wanted to see him like that again, never again, but it was foolish to think otherwise, now that he had died. It was inevitable now that he would be thrown into the supernatural world. I don't want him to be in pain again. I need to get stronger, so that next time I can fight by his side. So tied to this sudden surge of a thought, Kaneko's hazel eyes glowed a golden color before she leaned down till her face was inches from Issei's, before giving a small peck on his forehead. Looking down at him, she whispered in his ear, making sure her king was unaware of her questionable actions. Sleep well, Issei senpai. Pulling away with a bit of pink dusting her cheeks, she went to hold his hand as Rias made sure everything was in order. Okay Kaneko-chan, we're done here, so let's go back and have Issei-kun rest, she said while preparing a transportation circle for the both of them. Since she knew sleeping with him to heal his injuries were out of the question due to having been healed beforehand by whatever it was that he became, she needed to use this time to help Sona get things back in order. No matter how much she wanted to stay and do just that, if not heal him, then to see the embarrassed face of her cowhide. From what Akeno says, he does need to loosen up. Sadly I can't, well at least today, she thought with a small smirk. Getting the circle ready, she looked towards Kaneko. Let's go, Kaneko. The white-haired Nekashu didn't look away from Issei, but nodded nonetheless. Holding his hand in his own for a moment longer, she stood up and let go, neither of the two not noticing a small wisp of black and blue leave from Issei's hand and enter through Kaneko's. Hi but you. Walking to her king, both girls looked back at Issei before they vanished in a flash of red light. When they left, over the sounds of Yuma Rainer's snoozes, laying on his bed. Issei's closed eyelids twitched, his fingers convulsed and began clutching at the sheets of his bed. And slowly, without a sound, a black mist began to leak out from his eyelids, nose and mouth, and with a will of its own, it began to surround Issei's entire form. The darkness encroached, going to clutch on his form in his entire humanoid shape, and soon enough nothing of Issei was visible besides the shifting darkness that engulfed his being, hiding what was happening to him beneath the obsidian cocoon. But the most eventful of happenings was within his mind. Issei's mindscape. Floating, weightless and airborne, free and unrestrained like that of a bird flying through the sky. That's how he exactly felt at the moment, like a bird, floating and drifting through the sky without a care in the world. Yes, he could get used this feeling, nothing to ever worry him, nothing to trouble him ever again. But then he frowned as images of people began to appear inside his mind. Wait, yes, they were familiar to him now. First it was a happy couple, his parents, the ones who brought him into this world and raised him to be the man he was today. Then a small girl with light brown hair and violet eyes who was looking at him with a megawatt grin, even though her face was marred with mud and dirt. He knew this one as well, it was his first true friend, the one he hadn't seen since she left for England. Irina. The images didn't stop as more came and went, but a few stayed, 3 of which were familiar to him, though one he felt as if he didn't know yet he knew the person all the same. The first was of a girl with white hair and hazel eyes which looked up at him with nonchalance, but there was a glimmer of content in her eyes. Images of him patting her on the head, sitting with her and eating together. Yes, he knew this girl, it was coming back to him now. Hineko. Then another image appeared, one that which made his heart ache painfully. It was another girl with long silky black hair and violet eyes that just gleamed in happiness as she looked at him. What was this feeling he had when he looked at this girl? This painful thumping. The feeling of having his heart ripped to shreds. But then why did her smile cause him such warmth? Why did her laugh fill with so much joy? Wait. I'm sorry. Issei, she appeared again, but this time her eyes were weak, with her life growing weaker. Blood leaked from her mouth which ran down her chin. Wait. No. Uma. His eyes flickered open as that memory came crashing back to him, it was all coming back to him now. His relationship with Yuma, his date with her, relaxing in the park where Yuma and he just enjoyed being in each other's company while under the starry night sky. And then that man, Kakabiel, appeared and started speaking of Yuma being a fallen angel, her mission to kill him, her defying Kakabiel and Yuma. She tried to protect me. He realized before she was tossed aside, and the last thing he saw before his vision went black was Yuma's dying body cast off to the side. He remembered a piercing pain going through him and the dull aching agony of growing weaker and weaker. But then he remembered a feeling of absolute rage, of pure hatred surging from within him, and after that all he saw was black. The memory swirled within him, but was slowly melding back into him before more memories came, and these memories he didn't know of, but he felt as if he had experienced them. Being in places he hadn't seen before, giant vast plains of grasslands, a purple sky and a realm of fire and brimstone, a world bathed in gold and white. Then people appeared, people he never knew, and names he hadn't known began to meld into his mind, blending into his own soul. Amongst them he saw people that resembled humans, but had wings of different shapes and colors, some being white, gold, and black. Other creatures that he saw looked like crossbreeds of animals and humans, but then he saw these creatures, dragons. He corrected himself, that's all he could think as he saw them. Many of them varying from all shapes and sizes. Some bowed before him in reverence, others roared at him in challenge, and others lay broken and defeated by his hand. Among these dragons was another, ginormous in size. A flash of red caught his attention, golden eyes peering at him, as if trying to stare him down before looking away in a huff. But then he saw something. No, it was a someone, a young girl from what he could see. Her back was to him, but he could describe her to be rather young. She was dressed in a attire consisting of a gothic Lolita fashion, her long black tresses fell down her backside. Her hair shined with a blackness that was both foreboding yet in some way familiar to him. Now that he looked at her, he felt something in him churn, and it only got stronger as she began to turn toward him. Her pointed ears perked and twitched, her black hair parted way revealing a small smile aimed at him. That smile, this girl's presence, why did it make him feel all these emotions? Content. Happiness. Companionship. It was strange to Hyoudou Issei as his hand clutched his chest, trying in vain to calm his erratic heart, which felt as if it were going to burst from his chest. Who are you? He thought, but just as the girl was about to be fully facing him, she vanished, causing him to curse. He moved, situating himself until his feet was on whatever ground or floor beneath him. Looking around him, Issei felt a frown coming along. All he could see was just pitch black, for as far as the eye could, that's all there was. No trees, mountains, buildings, lakes, grass, no sky, not even a sun. There was just nothing here, just darkness. Where am I? He spoke, yet he didn't expect an answer anyway. And to be honest, he didn't want one, he just wanted whatever was happening to stop, all these memories that were melding with him. He clutched his head, fingers digging into his skull as he tried in vain to find some form of release from what he was feeling. It was like a pressure that was building up within him, and his head was crying out for a release. It came though, but in a way he hadn't expected. Do not worry yourself, Hyoudou Issei, you are just inside your own mind. His eyes snapped open wide as can be, and he turned to where he heard the force. But turning around he saw nothing but the empty black space around him. Gritting his teeth, Issei glared at the darkness around him, his frustration and stress reaching its limit. The strain of all these rushing memories was getting to him, and questions began to peg at him, making it all the worse. Was Yuma truly dead? What happened to Kakabiel? Was he dead? Who's there? Where are you? Right here. It was then everything stopped for Issei. It was as if time itself halted as a cold voice beckoned from behind him. He dared to turn, slowly but surely he commanded his body to turn, and he did despite the fact he felt his entire soul being frozen. It felt as if something was gripping his very being in an icy grip, and the slightest wrong move would result in his death. It was as he turned that Issei was greeted to a sight of something that was truly abnormal. It was a floating mass of mist or fog. It had a multitude of iridescent colors ranging from black, red, purple, green, white and blue. It was just about his size, and it just shifted and conformed as if it had a will of its own. Blinking, Issei just stared at it with a perplexed look. It was weird, but slowly he could feel all his stress be put at ease. Taking a step toward the fog, he tilted his head before reaching out toward it. Who? I'm glad I could see the face of my incarnation. The four spoke seemingly unhindered by Issei's confusion, which only grew at the mist's words. Wait, what do you mean by incarnation? And I'm in my mind. What's going on? Holding on to his head, Issei scowled as he tried to remember. But the mist just shifted patiently before it began to move on its own accord. Its voice, a voice Issei was beginning to think he heard before, spoke up. It's as I've said, you are my incarnation, you are the physical embodiment of that which I am, and as of now we are inside your mind. The voice spoke to the surprised Issei. The mist began to grow and began to form a shape. A humanoid one, and as it grew and took a form it began to show deeper characteristics to that of a human. What are you? He muttered, taking a step back as the form took shape, birthed from the mist, and molded from the darkness that was his mind. The mist slowly began to seep into this humanoid form until soon it was gone, and in its place was something that made the Hyoudou grow very pale. The figure was crouched but soon began to stand, and along the way it spoke. You already know who I am, Hyoudou Issei. I have been with you since the day you died at birth. I have always been there watching and waiting as you grew into the man you are today. You should know who I am, after all I am the reason why you feel that you are cursed, the humanoid spoke as it reached Issei's exact same height. It was a dawning realization for Issei as he beheld the form standing before him. It was coming to him now, fully realizing what this entity was saying. His light brown eyes stared back into a shade of golden red, his gaze staring into a reflection of himself. A mirrored image of him with every exact detail on the mark from his body structure, height and weight. Only differences were that his brown hair was jet black, his skin being deathly pale, and his golden red eyes that bore back at him with equal analysis. It's you. You're the one who's been there, my shadow, the energy that's always been haunting me. You're the reason why I can see all those spirits, the reason why I'm so different from other people. It was all coming together now as he looked back at his own inverted reflection. The energy that's always been with him since for as long as he could remember, the reason why he could see the spirits of the dearly departed, and the reason as to why he had always been more physically fit than his generation. He was staring at the reason, the sole entity responsible for it all. He felt as if he should have been angry, hateful and spiteful, but he couldn't find it in himself to bring up any kind of emotion like that. No, the only thing he could feel was a strange sense of familiarity, a sense of balance as he stood before his other half. He couldn't explain it, but it was something that resonated within him. It was something that was telling him that this entity was for all intents and purposes. It was at that moment Issei had an epiphany, a switch had been flipped, a long-forgotten truth that had been locked away at the very depths of his soul. Something he'd suppressed since he was young, it was coming back now, surging from within his body and coming to the forefront of his mind. Issei's eyes glazed over in realization. I get it now. Incarnation, the reason why you look just like me. You're not some evil spirit or such nonsense. No, you are me, aren't you? Questioning his look-alike, but he knew it was the correct answer. He didn't know why, but he was sure that he was right. And he was as the figure nodded before stepping toward Issei, who this time didn't step back from him. He didn't have a reason to. He didn't fear this entity, after all why should he fear himself? I knew you would figure it out. You've picked up on what few mortals can perceive, even more or less understand. Yes, I am you just as you are me, we are one and the same, you and I. There is so much you need to know, but that will come to you eventually when we become one. The most important of details, however, you must be made aware of. Issei's reflection, his other half spoke as he laid his own on the Hyoudou's shoulder. It was on that contact that all confusion within Issei was instantly swept away as his other half stared him, golden red eyes flashing with primordial power. Now realize what you are, behold what has come to pass, Hyoudou Issei. And realize he did, for Issei's eyes glowed with that same primordial glow, and he saw all that his other half saw. The scene played out like a recording, revealing to him what had happened just after he blacked out from being killed by Kakabiel. He saw himself in a third-person point of view and saw what was happening right before him. The rage, anger and hatred he felt burst out from within him, and it began to change his body. His light brown eyes slowly changed to a furious golden red. He saw his body explode with multiple colored energies that erupted from within his body, and soon it all began to meld into just a jet black color. The energy that he's felt since he was young exploded off him in waves. His changed eyes glaring at the fallen angel of legend before he saw himself roar at the sky, thus resulting in an explosion of all his power that's been inside him since he was but a newborn. He saw it all, the sky turning pitch black, the obsidian pillar erupting from him that pierced the sky. Witness it all, the time you died a second time and the time you were reborn anew. His other self's words echoed as he saw what happened. Through the blackness he saw clear as day. Kakabiel was floating in the sky looking down at where he was, staring down in terror at what had become of Issei. Then he saw himself, amidst a sea of ebony, standing lonesome, and what he saw both baffled him and awed him at the same time. His body was covered from his feet all the way to his neck in a billowing black cloak that shifted and moved as if it had a will of its own. The bottom burned away into tatters and reformed, and the sleeves reached just to his wrists. His light brown hair had become a shade of ebony and was reaching his shoulder blades. But the biggest change was the one upon his face. His eyes widened when he saw himself stand up, revealing his face was covered by a white mask that resembled something akin to the front piece of a skull or of an executioner's mask. It was then Issei saw it. Glowing through the eye holes of this mask was two golden red eyes which smoldered with an unmatched fury none could comprehend. He was left shocked to his core as he watched himself move without a word as walk towards a prone figure on the ground. He knew who it was hard not to, for it was the very same girl that he'd befriended at Kuo Academy, Amano Yuma. The very same girl that became his second friend, the girl he'd spent time with. Ever so joyful and happy around him, but at the same time he remembered what Kakabiel said about her. About her being something called a fallen angel, her true name being Rainer, and her mission to kill him. But she protected me at the end and died for it. He thought to himself as he saw himself walk towards Rainer, but along the way he saw a flash of red light, and what it was appeared to be a crimson runic circle of some kind of origin. Appearing from the light was two girls, two very familiar girls at that, with one of them making him grow even more surprised. Kaneko and Ria's senpai. What are they doing here? He asked himself, but could only watch as the scene played out. The two walking up to him, Kaneko trying to bring him out of whatever had happened to him, but he never vocally responded to her. He just looked at her, and Issei felt a twinge of regret for scaring Kaneko with his eyes. He then saw himself look to Ria's before looking back down at Rainer. He watched himself in amazement as he gently brought up Rainer's dead form, her dull lifeless eyes staring back at him, through him, and it showed that she truly was dead. However, he saw himself bring up his hand and conjure up something which soon formed into a wispy-like sphere, which gave off echoing cries and wails of a voice, Rainer's voice. He watched as he let the sphere go into her body and then healed her fatal wound to her heart. And as if a floodgate had been released, Issei felt immense relief wash over him as Rainer began to breathe again, her pulse returning to normal, and the beating of her heart returned once more. As she's alive. Thank goodness. He continued to watch after that, the proceedings of Kakabiel revealing himself to the unaware girls which caught them off guard. He began to scowl as he saw the girls tremble before Kakabiel's overwhelming presence. This angel guy must have been truly a terrifying being. But he was glad he saw himself step past the two and challenge Kakabiel himself and save the two girls from facing Kakabiel. And he was honestly amazed at how he saw the clearly one-sided fight progress. Those light spears did no damage to him and were simply absorbed into his body. Kakabiel tried to obliterate him with an even bigger spear of holy light, but what he did next was simply shocking. Channeling the energy that's been with him since he was a newborn, he saw himself swipe his hand in a vertical motion. This resulted in the spear splitting in half, but it didn't stop there as he saw half of Kakabiel's wings on one side of his body slowly detach themselves. They too having been cut by the invisible attack he unleashed. A smirk made its way on Issei's face as he heard Kakabiel's painful agonizing scream, taking a sweet twisted pleasure in hearing that bastard suffer for all he did. But then that smirk was wiped clean as he saw himself struggle, and it became clear to him what was happening. He remembered this, a stray memory buried deep within. Watching Kakabiel flee, he looked down as he saw himself lose consciousness and fall into the arms of Ria's, she and Kaneko, trying to find out what was wrong. Closing his eyes, Issei willing cast the rest of it away and opened his eyes again to stare back into the face of his other self. He finally understood what he saw just then, the cause of what changed him. It was literally staring back at him. I see you understand then, yes. His other self spoke, making Issei nod. The mystery was becoming clearer now, why he changed into that form, where all that power came from. Yes, it's clear to me it came from you, from within my own soul, but I am still confused about something. I know I died. So how did I come back? This bugged him. He was sure he was killed by Kakabiel, for he had felt that spear pierce his heart, instantly destroy it in mere seconds. What had brought him back from death? But it seemed his other half expected this and replied, how you came back to life is simple, but unique in of itself. You see, Issei, for you to understand you need to know more about yourself. You already know that you died when you were born, but you came back to life through an unknown force, aka myself. The truth is, you haven't been technically alive, but more to the truth, you have been in between life and death since that day. You've been walking an astral plane, a limbo of sorts between the living world and the realm of the dead. Because of this, you were able to see the spirits of the dead, those that were still chained by their regretful mortal ties to the human world. Now because of this, when you were killed by that fallen angel, he merely ended your human half, and the other half that was suppressed and chained in the deepest part of yourself was unleashed. How it came out was because of that girl, Ria's Gremory. She used a dark heart spell to resurrect you, a forbidden spell that had a nasty effect to kill the user if it backfired, but luckily it worked. Issei looked at his other half in astonishment, replaying what he just said. Ria's had used a spell to bring him back to life. Then I owe her a debt. He thought resolutely, if there was one thing he would always stick to, it would be that he would always repay those he owed one way or another, but his other half wasn't done and continued. You see, the spell was engraved on that brochure she gave you. She must have expected something to happen, and she wanted you to live. For what purpose, I am not sure, but because of her, instead of simply dying and becoming a true being of death, you were brought back and your soul was melded with my own. Thus, you and I became one entity, but our power was unleashed prematurely and resulted in a half-released botched state. This resulted in that form you saw just now. Our power is unstable, and the only way for it to balance itself out is for me to fully embrace my other side, for me to welcome you into my soul instead of opposing you. I must welcome that which I have always suppressed since I was a child. He finished, causing his other self to show the smallest of smiles. It was a smile of pride. Correct, and it would seem you are ready for the merge itself. Your soul is ready, but something tells me you are hesitant about something. Speak your mind, there is only yourself and I within this plane of existence. He said, and Issei frowned before he looked down at his hands. It's just that, now that I know, these memories, they are yours, and they show me that everything of the supernatural is real. Demons, angels, devils, fallen angels, all of it is real, and yet I ask myself, what am I? He stressed out each word while gazing back at his other half, who remained impassive throughout his words. Then he showed the slightest flicker of amusement. His golden red eyes seemed to glow in mirth, as if he just heard something that was funny. Issei, you should already know what you are. We are a being that transcends even that of the supernatural. But here's a hint, we are an entity that is everywhere. We are an omnipresent force that's been with creation since the dawn of time. Our name is feared and strikes terror into the hearts of all things. Souls cry out in terror, and we reap that which has reached the limit of their life. We are that which is forever eternal. We have had no beginning nor end. He said as he placed his other hand on Issei's other shoulder. He was rewarded with a glaze of understanding coming into Issei's eyes. Then that means, you know we are death, he said. It was a statement which was proven correct as his other half confirmed his words with a nod before his body began to evaporate into a misty fog. Nothing else needed to be said as the misty fog infused itself into Issei's body. There was no pain, no struggle, no nothing, as Issei fully embraced what he had suppressed for so long. It was a strange sense of serenity Issei felt as he became one with that which had ended his life as a newborn, but there was no anger, no hatred, just simple acceptance. And then Issei's body began to glow a bright white which soon exploded from within the black realm that was his mind. Outside real world. Issei's eyes snapped open only to see that he was staring up at the familiar ceiling that was his room. Slowly he pulled himself up from his position and moved his legs off the side of his bed. Standing up he moved toward his mirror, and he was greeted to a sight that made him small the tiniest amount. His once light brown hair had turned a tad darker, but it remained the same length as usual. There weren't many other physical changes than that besides his eyes now having a reddish tint to them. Seems even with the merge it will take time for my body to grow into the changes. Hearing a slight mumble, he turned his head and saw to his slight surprise, Yuma, no Rainer, he reminded himself, who lay asleep peacefully against his wall. Seeing that she was here as well meant that Rias and Kaneko must have brought her along when taking him back home. Seeing her now, alive and well, made Issei feel true joy in that alone. Seeing that it was still early in the morning, he walked towards Rainer's sleeping form and gently picked her up in a bridal carry and carefully laid her in his bed. Making sure he didn't wake her, he pulled the covers over her before he went to write a note for her. I need to go and get my head on straight. All these memories need to be adjusted, and I need the silence for just that. A good morning jog will help. Laying it on his nightstand, he went and got dressed, which consisted of a white undershirt and a black tracksuit with white trimmings. He put on a pair of old running shoes and stood up to leave, but before he left he turned back and walked up to his bedside. Looking down at Rainer, he leaned down and moved a stray black bang from her face, and he smiled a bit more. I'm glad you're alive, Rainer. Whether or not you feel like you betrayed me, you still protected me till the end. I may not have many friends, but from now on I will do all I can to ensure I can protect the friends I have with all I can. Pulling his hand away, he made sure she was tucked in before leaving. Rainer Azuma was always welcome at his home, warmly accepted by his parents a while back, and she had stayed at his home a few times for study sessions. So there was no need to be worried about his parents being shocked about there being a girl in his bedroom when it came to her. Though he was suspicious of their looks between him and Rainer, but he put it away from his mind. Unknown to him, he missed Rainer's smile in her sleep before she snuggled deeper into his pillow. Issei. Outside the Hyoudou residence, Issei took a breath of fresh air and looked up at the horizon. The sun was just breaking through the sky and was releasing its bright rays across the city. Looking up at the sky, he was glad to see the effects of what happened before were repaired. The sky was back to normal, and the city wasn't in absolute chaos, which was good, considering he had more than enough to deal with. Beginning his jog, Issei began to let the memories filter through his mind, the memories of him being a human, and the one of when he was death. He willed both to filter out from the cluster of a mess they were, and when he was sure of which belonged to where, he began to let both intermix in a balanced manner. The process was long, and Issei used that time to jog around his neighborhood a few times, and it wasn't until he felt his memories begin to settle that Issei decided to take a small break. Sitting down on a bench not far from his home, Issei leaned back and closed his eyes as he reeled in all that he had learned from the memories of his first life. The most prominent was the fact that the supernatural was in fact real, with all the things that humans have made up throughout history was in fact true. Heaven, hell or the underworld, angels, fallen angels, demons, devils, mythical creatures, the pantheon of gods of each culture. The Christian mythology, Greek mythology, Norse mythology, Japanese mythology, Buddhist mythology, Hindu mythology, these were just a few, but it was all real. And he was there. The memories showed he had always been there, watching everything up to the Great War play out, watching the 7 princes of hell fight it out against God and his heavenly angelic forces, the fall of the Watchers, Grigori, the alliance of the Devil's clans who allied with a number of demons and Yokai clans. Even the recluse dragons had either ignored the war or played a part in it. The memories of the war played through his mind, reminding him of all that had transpired until the point the war ended. It makes me wonder, do they still walk amongst humans? Do the angels still sit upon the heavens and make those that are faithful to their teachings do their work for them? What about those that have fallen? Where have they gone since the Great War ended? And what of the devils and demons? How have they recovered since those times? And what of the dragons? He thought to himself, pondering on all that he was learning, or well, in this case relearning. It was an experience that was for sure. To relive his first life was something to be unique. It made him chuckle bitterly to think I've been the incarnation of death itself. Me, Hyoudou Issei, being the physical embodiment of the primordial deity, eternity. Heh. Leaning back, his bitter smile grew as his dark brown bangs shadowed his eyes. Bringing up his hand, he channeled the smallest amount of energy he could muster, and he frowned when he saw his hand flickered with a blackish aura. Willing it away, he sighed as he spoke to seemingly no one. I guess I have to accept it, the fact that I am no longer human. Suddenly and without warning, he felt it, a slight breeze in the air, a scent that he knew on an instinctive level, a presence that he had known for so long and yet hadn't felt for eons. His smile vanished and his expression went neutral, shifting his head forward, his brown reddish eyes stared through the bangs of his hair. His gaze landing on a figure, a very familiar figure at that, who was just within arm's reach of himself. Brown reddish orbs stared into a pair of surprised grey orbs, and at that moment Issei spoke with his voice remaining completely neutral. And now we meet again. How long has it been? Infinity. He said the name without emotion, his gaze staring deep into the grey orbs of OPHIS, the Ouroboros dragon, the infinite dragon god. The small girl stared back at Issei with no small amount of surprise in her eyes. She spoke, intent to respond back to the one she so wished to be reunited with for so long. It has been far, far too long, eternity. And thus the reunion of the true primordial dragon god and the infinity had come at last after so many eons. Chapter 4. Eternity and Infinity. Neutral brown red eyes stared into a pair of surprised grey orbs, analyzing the person before him. Hyoudou Issei, the true primordial dragon god, Death, sat staring into the face of his counterpart. It was a female who had the appearance of a young girl with long silky black hair that fell like a smooth ebony silk curtain which reached her backside. She had a milky white complexion, while her attire consisted of solely a gothic Lolita dress, but she had nothing covering her feet. Standing before him was the equivalent of his own existence, and if his memory served him correctly, then this was the first time he's seen her for a very long time. Eons to be exact. He corrected himself. If memory served accurately, then he hadn't seen her for that long, and it wasn't because of his choice, mind you, it was hers. Staring back at him with a swirl of emotions ranging from surprise, anxiety, happiness, confusion and the slightest bit of nervousness. One may begin to wonder why she felt this way, but it could only be understood between herself and Issei. If anyone at the current moment who knew this girl saw her this way, they would be astonished or would be questioning as to why she would be showing such emotion. After all, this in the eyes of the rest of creation was the enigmatic legendary OPHIS, the Ouroboros dragon and the infinite dragon god, a figure highly feared and revered at the same time. But even if such people were there, they wouldn't be acknowledged. This was a reunion long in wait for the both of them, a very anticipated one for OPHIS, who stared back at Issei with equal intensity. The wind blew through her long obsidian hair, and for the longest of moments that seemed to drag on for light years, the two kept their stare with one another. Each finding no fault in each other's form, studying each other's eyes, looking at each other's soul with masterful ease. If anyone saw this scene, they wouldn't have known that they were looking at the two primordial deities that were as old as the dawn of time itself. And then with the smallest of gestures, Issei scooted to the side and welcomed her. "Come. Sit," gesturing to the empty space beside him. She raised a delicate brow, but did not wait a moment longer, and took a seat beside him. The two sat there looking out to the sky and watched it begin to rise further and further. A tense atmosphere was between the two. That is until OPHIS broke the ice between the two. "I see you found yourself a material body?" she asked, only for Issei to frown before closing his eyes. "No, this isn't just a physical body. Unlike you, I incarnated myself into a mortal," he said, making her eyes widen in surprise before she turned her head to look at Issei. However, understanding began to appear in her grey eyes before she gave a nod. "I see, that explains the difference, plus I can feel the another soul within you, is it?" she trailed on, getting Issei to nod in response. "Yes, after being incarnated he was woken up from within my soul, but for now he sleeps until I ask for him." He knew what she was asking him, about the other soul who dwells within him. The being that was placed inside him at birth. He was awakened at the same time he was killed by Kakabiel, but was put to sleep until such a time that Issei felt he would need to call for him. "I see," she said, and silence soon fell for the two. Issei saw that it was reaching morning, so students for Kuo Academy should be waking up soon and getting ready to leave. "I'll be running a tad late though," he sighed as he felt OPHIS looking at him, trying to discern him, and he decided to confront her about this. "So why are you here, OPHIS? Figured you would never leave the dimensional gap," he said, addressing her by the name she took upon herself long ago. One of his stray memories came to him, and it was of OPHIS speaking of that realm, always having the silence and quiet she always wanted. She averted her gaze and seemed to mumble something, but he heard her perfectly well. "I can no longer enjoy the dimensional gap like I used to. That fledgling great red got too powerful in your absence and has taken refuge inside and has been causing a ruckus since then." It was a hesitant admittance on her part, and his brow perked up at that. The memories came to him. Was that what he was called now, Great Red? He was a very special dragon, for he was a very unique dragon who represented the illusions of dreams, but still he was but a very young dragon back then, always being a stubborn hothead. But to think he would become powerful enough to throw infinity out of the home she's used since the dawn of creation. His eyes narrowed on her. "What's the real reason you're here? Even if Great Red became that powerful, you are still infinity, and your power is absolute. He should be of no trouble to you, so why are you really here?" It was the truth, for as far as he knew. She was his counterpart, his equal in existence. Why would she be unable to force that fledgling out of the dimensional gap? He glanced to her, but raised an eyebrow when he saw her avert her gaze from him, and was he mistaken, or was there a pinkish hue on her cheeks? "I never could get past you." "Yes, I may have another reason," softly spoke. She looked up at Issei with a hesitant frown on her face. The Hyoudou looked back at her with a perplexed look which just got deeper as the pinkish hue on her cheeks got darker. I wanted to see you, eternity," she said as her hand slowly went to grasp his own, causing his eyes to widen slightly at her words. A sudden influx of memories hit him then, of when he was just the formless entity, and it made him remember exactly why they were separated in the beginning. Narrowing his eyes, he removed his hand. "That's funny, because I seem to remember that you wanted to be alone after all life had been formed. It was your choice to leave, so why come back?" There was a tad bit of bite in his tone, and OPHIS flinched at it, but she couldn't blame him for being that way. She did leave under rather stressful times for the both of them. It hadn't been fair to eternity back than to leave him with the aftermath of the megaton supernova that both spawned life and destroyed it. But at that time she just wished for complete and utter solitude. Nothing else mattered to her at that one point in time, but she had been wrong to have done that, and to him of all people. It had been a mistake she regretted since the day she separated herself from him. She retracted her hand, a bit hurt, but she understood all the same. "I know that, and there is no way I can ever ask for your forgiveness due to that selfish act on my part, but I've regretted that choice. It was a mistake. After the Great War, one wanted to come see you, but after you harvested the souls that died, you vanished, even from my senses. At that time it was as if you wiped yourself from existence. I thought something had happened to you. I grieved for so long thinking I wouldn't ever be able to apologize to you for what I did. She said this while holding her hand, cherishing what lingering contact she had with the man beside her. Issei just kept his gaze dead set ahead of him, just staring out at nothing in particular, that is, until he sighed and began to rub his forehead, fighting a slight headache. He could tell Infinity Office was truly and honestly heartfelt in her words, but it was a scar that wouldn't go away, no matter how much time passed. But he couldn't allow himself to carry the grudge against her, especially not after being incarnated. It just wasn't right. There is a saying among these mortals, OPHIS, and that is, people can forgive the sins of another, but they will never forget them. You're sorry and you mean it. And I forgive you, but I won't forget it either. He said with the slightest grumble. He scowled when her eyes widened to a great degree, and he remained stone still as she scooted closer to him. Thank you. Softly spoken as ever, but harder words. He could feel the gratefulness in her tone, and it made him smile the slightest inch. However, he felt her piercing stare on him and decided to speak. What is it, OPHIS? What happened to you? After the Great War you vanished from all of creation. You changed from the eternity I once knew. Something is different about you now. She said, pondering on the change that had happened to him. He gave a sigh but answered nonetheless. You already know this, but after you left, I chose to take up the mantle of the one who was to balance out the results of what light and darkness had created. Thus I became what history sees me as. I became death. I had to be the one who reaped the souls of the living to counterbalance the en masse of life that spawned in the three realms. Be they mortal, demon, angel, devil, god or animal, it had become my responsibility to make sure the balance was kept in check. I rarely ever checked up on you, and that may have been because of my own stubbornness. He said, remembering the duties he once held during those ancient times. He could feel her gaze on him, but he continued unperturbed. I spread myself out among the three realms, becoming an omnipresent force by the time the Great War initiated. After the war was finished, then I had harvested all the souls that had vanquished and sent them to their respective places. I cast myself out. I longed for a change in my own existence, and I found it by incarnating my essence in one who I felt was worthy, which is what happened prior. There was a slight change in the incarnation, but it worked, and I incarnated myself with a mortal named Hyoudou Issei and melded ourselves as one entity. Our personalities, souls, views in the world mixed as we became one, so that will explain if I seem different. I see. She said, contemplating on what was spoken. Her orbs took great interest in his appearance, as unlike her who created her body through the nothingness of her own existence and the essence of her soul. Eternity gained his body through incarnation through a mortal human. He must have experienced many things that she was alien to up until this point. So what have you been up to in my absence? Deciding to further the conversation. OPHIS looked up at the sky and gave a small sigh. Well, as you know, I can't enjoy the dimensional gap like I used to, and all because of that ignorant fledgling Great Red. So I've been building up a force to help take it out, gathering up all sorts of figures from different backgrounds and heritages to face it, angels, devils, demons, humans with heroic ancestry and others. I've named it the Chaos Brigade. Would you want? She was about to ask, but he cut her short with a quick and simple retort. Not interested. His lips twitched upwards when he saw her give the equivalent of a pout before deciding to elaborate. I have no need to concern myself with your army of disaster. That red fledgling never crossed me and does not warrant my wrath. And until such a time happens, if it happens, I will stay my hand. But I am curious how you can lead such a vast army of individuals that are former enemies and keep them in line. What do you do to make them follow your word? He said, half expecting her to say something intelligent and resourceful. I just told them to help me kill Great Red, and nothing else would matter to me. What? He spat out in surprise, his tone lowering down to the lowest whisper as he stared at his counterpart with wide eyes. OPHIS, not understanding his surprise, tilted her head. What? Are you telling me you have gathered up an army of supernatural entities, former enemies at that, and have led them with solely one goal, to kill Great Red, and if they help you then nothing else mattered to you? His answer was a nod which made him stare at her even longer. As if he were looking at a foreign creature or alien. You cannot be serious. He placed his hand over his face and sighed as OPHIS just kept looking at him with a perplexed look, acting completely innocent and as if she hadn't said anything outrageous. You're naive if you think they will follow your command solely based on such a loose goal, OPHIS. If they don't follow your rule to the letter and begin threatening the balance. He said, staring at her through the cracks of his fingers. His eye took on a cold glaze that made her flinch, and as it should, she should know how important it was for the balance to be preserved. If she could gather up such a force of mixed races, then good for her, he didn't care. However, what he did care about was the balance, and if it were to be put in peril, then an Armageddon will be unleashed upon all of creation once again. Don't worry, I will make sure that they stay under my heel. She stuttered, which made her flush in embarrassment. Even now, after just incarnating himself, eternity can still put her in line. It was both scary and exhilarating to her. It was a joyous day to know her equal was back. Issei removed his hand and kept his eye on her for a good moment longer, and she would have began squirm had he not cut his gaze away a second later. See, it stays that way then. Silence fell upon the two again, but it wasn't a tense atmosphere like it once was. Looking up at the sky, Issei saw that it was reaching that time. It's near time to get ready for another day at the academy, and I have some questions for little Miss Gremory-san. His eyes narrowed on that thought about his crimson-haired senpai. She used that spell on him and wanted him to live for a reason, and he wanted to know why. Standing up, he glanced to OPHIS. Well, I gotta go. If there isn't anything else you wanted to talk about, then I must be off. But OPHIS moved before he could take a step, her hand grasped onto his tracksuit, making him stop. Looking over his shoulder, he saw her look up with a somewhat strange look in her eye. Let me come with you? I don't want to be separated from you again, please. She asked, no more like pleaded with him to let her stay with him, to be by his side again after so long of being alone. He just kept looking at her while inwardly he contemplated if such an idea was good or not. It's not like it will hurt anything, sure Ka-san and Tu-san may find it strange, but I'll probably be able to spin it off should they ever find out about her. Plus, from what I feel, her power has strangely declined in my absence, so keeping her with me until it's recovered is essential. Sighing yet again, something he was taking notice of doing a lot of late. Looking down at OPHIS, he took her hand and nodded, making her face light up with a brightened expression. Very well, but how would you manage your Cows Brigade while you're with me? He asked, causing her to smile the slightest bit before she raised her other hand, and he watched with a raised brow as a couple of black snakes slithered out from her sleeve. Simple, I just have to create a copy of myself with about 1/3 of power supply. That should be sufficient enough for them to take my copy seriously and not ask questions. She explained as the snakes left her hand and began to form an exact copy of her, down to every exact detail. Appraising the copy, he turned to the original OPHIS, whom shooed the clone away, whom nodded, knowing what her objective was and vanished. Resourceful, but you will need to follow one condition if you're going to be staying with me for the time being. He said, causing her to tilt her head. Like? Well, I certainly can't have those that know of your existence see you around me. When we're alone, that's fine, but I don't want the hassle of other supernatural beings prodding about you. He said, making her tilt her head before smiling. I got it. Making sure no one was around, she raised her hand. She jumped before she was enveloped in a poof of smoke. When it cleared, Issei saw that she had shifted herself into a low-flowing black scarf, which he caught and gave it a look. It was a simple black scarf with tattered ends, but with a faint design of a dragon. That'll work, I guess. He said as he saw a pair of gray eyes appear from within the scarf which looked at him. Yes, some believe I can just shape-shift into different people, but shifting into objects isn't beyond my reach. He heard her from within his mind, causing him to roll his eyes before he wrapped the scarf around his neck. Securing her around him and letting the end flow behind him, running a hand through the scarf, he let out a small smile as he felt OPHIS enjoy the touch. Welcome back, Infinity. Pulling the scarf up to hide his mouth, he heard her hum with appreciation within his mind. Glad to be back, Eternity. Hearing this, Issei started to walk away, intent on heading back home to get ready for the academy and to deal with the problems ahead of him. One of which he was sure was Umarainer's dilemma and Ria's Gremory's motives with bringing him back to life. But as he was leaving, he felt OPHIS ask him something that nearly made him trip in surprise. By the way, why are you going to an academy? Feeling a sweat drop begin to form, he sighed before patting the scarf around him. Because since many around me, including my parents that brought me into this world, consider me human, I'm intent to at the very least attain an education, as they say. She remained silent for a moment before she gave an honest response. I think it's a waste of time. She said, since it cut off her time to spend with Eternity Issei by a good margin. Issei just chuckled, but continuing on. Underworld Gremory Castle. Surzich's Lucifer was not in the best of moods today as he sat alongside his wife Grafia. He rubbed his temples as his wife handed him a cup of tea, which he took gratefully. All this damage. This hasn't happened for so long. He said. Currently he was going through a number of reports issued to him that spanned his territory as the Lucifer Satan. Since the Apocalyptic Omen, a title created by a number of Elder Devil Seers, which ended up with all four Maus being flooded with reports of incidents ranging from damages to many of their cities, including both the original capital Lucifid and their current devil capital city, Lilith, were damaged greatly in the wake of the disaster. It just went to show whatever caused this had the power to even bypass their protective barriers and wards and destroy much of their cities with ease. That wasn't even taking into consideration of the multiple unstable points across their realm. Even after the event had passed, it still left lingering effects on the underworld and their realm itself. Reports came in about multiple unstable points that were in need of repair, which came as one of the major priorities to the Yondaimam, which were himself as Lucifer, Leviathan, Asmodeus and Beelzebub. It was an integral part to have the realm that kept the underworld in full repair, otherwise if left unchecked, it could cause an imbalance and threaten the very underworld itself. Then there was the transportation monorail allowing them an easier passage from the underworld and to Earth, which was out of use due to the rails having been destroyed. That wasn't even counting the fact the dimensional gap they had to pass through was still unsafe due to being affected as well by the event. To even begin repairs would take a lot of time and resources for not just his people, but for all the mams and of the 34 of the 72 noble devil clans. He could already hear the elders of many of them complaining about spending so much of their budget, but he wouldn't have any of it. This was for the underworld as a whole and to keep it, their home, from falling apart and into disarray. Then there was the amount of casualties that had happened, and by Satan himself, there were far too many for Surziches to account alone. It seemed many were caught by the flood of darkness and were neither never seen again or were reduced to ashes. Detailed report specified that their bodies were just rotting away, as if time itself fast forward for them and reduced them to nothing but empty dried up husks or just ashes. And personally, from what Surziches saw what this darkness did across the underworld, he felt those devils were lucky to have died that way instead of being sucked into the darkness. This was a big impact to the devils as a whole, since many of the devils that died were either some purebloods or high-ranking reincarnated devils. Beside dropping the reports on his desk before leaning his head back as he tried to ease his headache and growing unease of the whole situation. Why did this have to happen? The underworld has been so peaceful since the Great War ended. Everything was going smoothly and this happens. Graphia worried for her husband laid her hand on his shoulder which he felt and was appreciative for the gesture. Please don't exert yourself, Surziches, no one could have predicted something like this to happen, and you know as well as I that no peace can last without trouble brewing its head. She said, and it was true that he knew he just wanted this era to be peaceful for a good few more years. At least until his sister had matured and was ready for whatever was coming. I know. It's just that I'm worried. Besides all this chaos in our own home, I'm worried about Riaz and her peerage. Seraphol's been wanting to go to Earth to see if her sister and her group is fine, but with all the work piling up and the underworld in such a state she's needed to stay as well. And there's also the fact the other noble clans are causing a ruckus since that event passed. I mean Graphia, they're even talking about this being caused by the Kikmulha. Old Satan faction. His words made her silver eyes narrow at that. The old Satan faction had been very quiet, nearly non-existent in their movement, but if this were true. If it's true, then would they be declaring war by doing this? She asked, only for Surziches to sigh before shaking his head. No, though they are incredibly stubborn and foolhardy at times, even they would not stoop this low as to attack their own homeworld like this. Besides, even they do not possess the sheer raw power to do something of this magnitude. He said, although he wasn't entirely sure of it himself since information on them was scarce. There is also word of the Phoenix clan causing a number of incidents as well, Surziches. She reminded him, causing him to give a slight curse. Oh yes, how could he have forgotten about that? To be honest, the entire clan was starting to reach the end of his nerves. Ever since the incident ended, they had been flooding the Gremory clan with hundreds of notices about them, wanting to bring back Riaz from the earth, all in due part because of the political marriage set between her and the heir of the Phoenix clan, Rizer. Just thinking about that boy, Rizer, made Surziches very unhappy. The third son to the Phoenix clan was, in his honest and personal opinion, a slime ball piece of trash that didn't deserve to even be in the same presence as his little sister. And if he had his way, the boy wouldn't even see the light of day again with his demands for Riaz's hand in marriage. But the marriage contract was set between his father and the Lord Phoenix as a way to create a bond between both clans and help establish this through union through both the third son of the Phoenix and heiress of the Gremory. Since pure-blooded devils were becoming a rarity, it could prove to be a beneficial boon if a pure-blood child was created through that union. Yet it made him sick to his stomach that his sister was being forced against her will to marry that little brat. It was a good thing he was able to step in at the time and give her leeway to go to Earth so she could try to find her own way out of this contract. But beyond that, he couldn't do anything else. Honestly, why Tucson and Kasan continues to support this endeavor is beyond me. He thought with a tad bit of spite. It was clear to him, Riaz didn't want anything to do with the marriage, and he figured their parents would respect that. But they were too traditional to see it that way. It was a miracle that he was even able to get them to agree with his plan for Riaz alone. Currently his parents were away to the Phoenix clan to try and reason with them about the current situation. I know, Graphia, I'm just hoping Tucson and Kasan can reason with them and hold them off for just a little longer. He said, to which she nodded. She knew her husband disliked the entire thing to a great degree, and she couldn't blame him. Riaz's fiancé, Rizer, was just not a suitable man for her nor for any woman. He was, in her mind, an arrogant, womanizing, sexist pig that wasn't suited to be married to her little sister-in-law. Thinking about his sister, Surziches sighed. I hope Riaz is okay. Earth Hyoudou residence. Amanu Umar Rainer, fallen angel and member of the Grigori organization, had never anticipated to find herself in this type of situation. Her long black hair was a bit damp and was brushed in a way she liked it. She had just gotten out of the shower and was currently dressed in her spare school uniform she had left at the Hyoudou home. Currently she was in said home, sitting down at the table eating breakfast with Issei's parents. Her body was acting on auto drive, eating and answering her questions from Issei's parents. But inwardly she was numb to the whole world as she tried to desperately figure out how she ended up in this situation. Kakebiel killed me. I know he did, and yet here I am, alive and well. What happened? She thought to herself in confusion. She remembered it all from having a date with Issei, which made her flush a bit, to relaxing in the park under the starry night sky. And then Kakebiel appeared, revealing who she was to Issei and attacking both her and the Hyoudou. She remembered it all in clear detail, how she tried to defend Issei, protecting him and apologizing to him in her final moments. His shocked, haunted look even now made her body tremble from the look in his eyes as darkness overcame her. Craner. Think. Try and remember. And she did, trying to think back to what had happened just before she died. The only thing she saw was Issei being killed by Kakebiel, but then the unimaginable happened. Issei began to change in her dimming vision. Black energy began to leak off him, his hair had grown to his shoulder blades and had turned pitch black, and his normally warm brown eyes flashed a cold golden red. And there was also the fact his face was being covered by something. What was it? The flash of a porcelain bone white mask with the shape of a frontal skull appeared, and had she not the self-control, she would have jumped with a slight scream. I remember now. What happened to him? What happened to us? Why are you leaving me with so many questions, Issei-kun? She thought to herself, thinking back to when she woke up an hour and a half ago. She was very surprised to find herself not dead, but in fact alive and in Issei's bed. It was normal at times for her to fall asleep in his bedroom, since she had done it a few times when she came over to study with him, which ended up in a few embarrassing situations. But never in his very own bed, and she could tell he was there recently due to his warmth and scent still there. She did her best to hide her cheeks from flushing to a scarlet when she realized where her thoughts went on that part. She shook her head at that and remembered that after waking up and realizing she was actually alive, tried to find Issei, but unlike before she couldn't sense his presence anywhere in the vicinity. It was then she found the note he left for her, and she was both relieved and a bit apprehensive of what it said. He had gone out on his morning jogs and would be back in time to be ready for school, but she was nervous to see him, since it also said that they would be discussing the matters with what happened last night. Did he know? If so, how? He was a human. Wasn't he? She was sure he didn't want anything to do with her again after finding out what she did. So many questions rang through her head at that moment that she just wished Issei would hurry back so she could have them answered. Briefly she wondered if her fellow fallen angels had fallen by Kakebiel's hand, but then again that man wouldn't waste time and risk alerting Azazel and Shemhazai. Honestly, he's taking longer than usual. I wonder if he's okay. She was brought out of her musings when she heard Issei's mother speak, only for his father to respond with a smile. Oh, don't worry, love, Issei should be here any minute now, he said before they heard the door open, causing him to smirk. And speak of the devil, and he shall appear. The two missed Yuuma's flinch and nervous expression as the sound of footsteps came closer until the door opened, revealing Issei. Sorry I'm late, Ka-san. Tusen, I took a small detour on my way back and bought myself something for the winter, Issei said with a smile while pointing to his black scarf. His parents seemed to take notice of it and nodded. That's okay, but you better hurry and get ready for school. You don't want to have Yuuma-chan go alone, right? His mother said, causing him to blink before he turned his gaze toward a silent Yuuma who glanced at him. His eyes met hers and for a moment she couldn't tear her gaze away from his. It was for only a moment before his mouth slowly formed into a smile, a knowing smile that made her eyes widen before he looked towards his parents. Yeah, I got it. Grabbing a piece of toast, he ran upstairs to get his uniform before heading to the shower. An hour passed and soon Yuuma and Issei were leaving his house and heading on their way to Kuo Academy. Both were in their respective academy uniforms, only Issei had his scarf around his neck. Issei had his sack of supplies slung over his shoulder, and Yuuma thankfully had some supplies left at his house, had them in hand. To others it would seem like the two were just fellow classmates, but on the inside it was much different. Yuuma was nearly sweating in nervousness, the atmosphere around her, and Issei was so tense you could cut it with a butter knife. Every now and then she would dare to glance his way, but look away just as quick. She didn't know what to say or even how to begin to break the ice between them. She wasn't sure if all that happened last night was real or if it was just a dream. Did he know? Had she dreamed it all? She didn't know and she was a bit scared to find out. Deciding to look his way again, she sighed before speaking. It was better now than later. So? She was silenced when his hand landed on her shoulder, caused her to flinch, but she looked up and she blinked a few times when she did. Had Issei always been this tall? It was sudden thought that entered her mind as she looked up at the Hyoudou. Sure, he was always tall for his age, but as she looked up to him, becoming nearly lost in his brown-red eyes, she saw. Felt something had changed in him. Rainer, before you say anything, let me just say despite what you did in the past, or were ordered to do, just know that I forgive you. His words left him and her eyes widened once she heard her name, her true name, be spoken by him. But there was no deceit, no anger, no hatred, just pure unadulterated warmth in his eyes. He knows. How do you? But. Why? I don't understand. She struggled to speak, but his arm circled around her shoulders and pulled her flush to his side. Feeling the rippling of his wiry muscled arm and body made her tingle delight. It's simple, we can talk about it after school, but for now just know that even though you were ordered to kill me, you still became a very close friend. Instead of following through with your order, you protected me and died doing so. Because of that, I couldn't hate you no matter how much it hurt. You can tell me whatever you wish at any time and when you feel comfortable about it. I know all I need to know, so don't worry about keeping it a secret from me. Don't be so tense around me, okay? He said, meaning every single word. He'd been thinking to how address her about the situation, but he just decided to be upfront and blunt about it. He had been hurt and felt a bit betrayed, but Yuma had defended him and died, giving her life for him. She had become a very close friend to him, and despite his new status, he was going to cherish Rainer as much as he would cherish Irina and Kaneko. Issei. Thank you. He smiled as she leaned herself against him, keeping her steady. Although he felt a bit cynical with his change, what would never change is his loyalty to the friends he had. He felt close to you, Rainer, he corrected himself, as close as he felt to Irina before she left for England, and it was the same with his little kohai, Kaneko. Unknown to him, Rainer was staring up at him, and one of the most brightest sad smiles adorned her beautiful features. You already know. And yet you forgive me. I don't deserve someone as special as you. And unknown to even her and Issei, OPHIS within the scar frowned at fallen angel that is hanging on to her eternity. Oh yes, OPHIS would be watching this girl very very closely. Unknown location. The sound of cackling bones echoed all around the dimly lit chamber. The souls of the damned screamed and wailed in an endless agonizing symphony as they swirled in a giant vortex, heading towards their imminent punishment, reaching the purgatory where all souls of the damned go. Having had judgment passed down on them, those sentenced to damnation were sent here and were distributed through the vortex of souls. Each soul with a certain level of sins would be sent to an adequate circle of hell pending on what those sins were the majority of. Be they of lust, gluttony, greed, wrath, heresy, violence, fraud and treachery. There was no mercy, no love or passion, just cold punishment for the sinful, with no hope of retribution for anyone in this place. Hanging above this vortex was a number of rocky platforms which were strung up by a number of giant spiky black chains. Guarding these platforms were a number of armored skeletons and undead warriors and sorcerers, while walking past them were a number of humanoid figures with billowing black cloaks that covered most of their bodies, along with a hood that shadowed their faces. Held in hand were long wooden scythes, although some had alterations to their weapon of choice. Amidst these platforms, the lowest one led deeper into the catacombs of the area. Deeper and darker it became until finally was a giant chamber. It was a throne room decorated with corpses, skeletons and skull. Braziers made of bone and skulls of demonic creatures hung among the walls and were lit with blue fire. Standing guard at the entrance and along the walkway were a number of heavily armored skeletons with bits of rotten flesh still clinging to their body. Their eye sockets glowed with an unholy blue light, showing that it was the only sign that they had some life in their reanimated bodies. Leading up to the throne sat a single figure garbed in priest-like robes. It was another skeleton that was much taller than the rest and gave off a creepy and malicious aura. So intense it would have threatened to snuff out all life in the area if such a being were amongst those of the living. Its skull was covered by a hood, but it grinned as the skeleton's eyes bore down at the figure standing before him. So, how do your new wings feel, Kakabiel? The skeleton cackled, humor escaping its body, causing its ribsage to rattle as the figure before him, Kakabiel, in all his fallen glory, smirked up at the figure with a glow of respect. He tested his new wings on his one half, made entirely of torn flesh and bone, and hummed in content. They feel very adequate, Lord Hades. His smirk stretched across his face, his yellow eyes glowing with a hint of madness as the Olympian god, ruler of the realm of the dead, brother of Zeus and Poseidon, cackled further. His eyes flashed with an unholy light as they bared down on his newest subject with twisted glee. Very good. That's it, guys. Hopefully you enjoyed it. With that, take care.